Morning. So my name is Caitlin. I'm from UCL. I'm part of our counter-terrorism research group. What I'm going to be talking about today is based very much on the work Bettina and I have been doing for Incite, but this particular project is led by our colleague Sandy Schumann and funded by NABS. So we had lots of brilliant presentations yesterday, looking, loads of really great emerging research in this space, and I was really taken aback at the kind of advancement since, we started having these conversations. And there's lots of great work about describing the communities, the content, and like mapping the threat kind of ecosystem. That very complicated analysis is out of my reach. So I don't focus so much on what's going on the screens. I look more at the person, the individual sat behind the screens. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I think everyone in this room probably agrees the COM hybridizes harms, it collapses the silos that we might have seen between different types of harms. But what I'm particularly interested in is, are there kind of patterns of the risk factors and motivational drivers associated with these different harms? So I set out trying to disaggregate patterns of behaviour associated with different harmful behaviours that we see in the novel data set. I want to be very clear, these are not types of people, because loads of them are doing loads of stuff in there, right? So it's patterns of engagement associated with the presence of one behaviour or not. And I can explain that more if it's not very clear in the Q&A, if anyone's particularly interested. So Bettina beautifully saved me lots of precious minutes, and I'm not going to explain the novel data set, right, because we've had a great overview of that. But we used a subset, slightly different operationalization of some of the variables. Again, if people are particularly interested in that, I'm happy to take questions. Afterwards, we looked at these 4 outcomes. Obviously, there's loads more. We call them outcome behaviors. There's loads more. We had to pick 4 for the type of the analysis. They kind of loosely map onto the pillars that people have theorized, and then obviously we wanted to have a look at those who take a leadership role as well. And then we had to pick 11 risk factors and motivational drivers, and that's based off loads of the research that people in this room and beyond have been doing. Again, there's loads more we had to pick. And the type of analysis that we did, probably not particularly interesting to most of you, so I'll just briefly say, we didn't look at single things or kind of prevalence of single things. Novel's done that brilliantly. We looked at the combination of things, so patterns of behaviours occurring together, and then the temporal sequencing of them. So after we looked at combinations, we put those combinations in sequence of when they emerged in kind of a perpetrator's pathway and did some analysis on those. So with the limited time, I'm not going to talk in depth about all the findings. I'm going to give you some just highlights. So probably unsurprisingly, right, the COM's not one thing, and there's not one type of perpetrator. There are a few that did one thing. Most of them are doing loads of things. One of them was doing all the things. On the other side, there's a kind of breakdown of the distribution of outcome behaviours. So it might be surprising that there's loads of leadership. We conceptualize leadership. You can be like the owner of a server, or you can be the administrator of it. So, it's not leadership like we would see in an offline group. So there's lots of nuance about how these sub-communities overlap and the diversity of harms. But between sub-communities and within these sub-communities and between and within individuals, there's, another level of diversity that we can understand. So all of these things were present basically across all of them. Right? They all had these things. These are the things that we looked at, the 11 things that I mentioned that we picked up, that we sort of picked for various reasons. So the important finding's not what was present, because it's all present. So the question's not what risk factors are associated with an outcome. It's what role do the factors play, and that's where the sequencing became important, because we can start to look at where and when some of these emerge in a sequence. So you get to sort of get at the role that the factors are playing, the function of the behaviour. So very briefly, and Bettina hinted on this, an outcome that included offline violence, a lot of the combinations were centred around this ideological driver. We had a broader definition of ideological driver for our funders' purposes, who were kind of interested in is ideology driving these communities, and Ideology includes like nihilism, misanthropy, those kind of, like a coherent belief system. So we have a slightly different definition. But the combinations, the repeated kind of high consistency combinations centered around this kind of ideological driver. For sextortion, it was around status. So lots of combinations, status and mental health, status and neurodiversity, status and belonging drivers. Everything was anchored around status, so that seeking of status. In terms of cyber offending, we had much fewer of these cases. Our results are much more tentative. They're not something that I would, absolutely 100% stand behind. These are just some inferences we've made from the data, but there was a centering of the combinations around neurodevelopmental conditions, and that was predominantly autism and ADHD, and Rachel beautifully set out earlier, some of the reasons why that might be. And in terms of leadership, the anchoring was around previous violence. So they had done something before. So, a capacity, a demonstrated capacity of engaging in these types of behaviours before. So this just demonstrates how lots of things are there, but they have different kind of functional roles in sequencing, in understanding the pathways of these people. So, a really good example of this was how violence fascination appeared. This was a really kind of clear finding that came out. The sequences I'm showing on the screen are very simple versions of the sequences that we uncovered, but it just demonstrates my point. So in offline violence fascination emerged way earlier in the sequence, along with early transgressions, previous violence. So it's demonstrating potentially the pre-existing violent propensity, so they already have a propensity for violence. Then they encounter, through the online ecosystem, an ideological kind of, or belief system. We're not going to debate what an ideology is today. Well, maybe we will, but not now in my 12 minutes. And then that kind of progressed onto violence. In terms of sextortion and leadership roles, it emerged much later in sequence. So it's almost to maintain the kind of fulfilling, Bettina talked a lot about unmet needs, to maintain their involvement, their belonging, their sense of status, they're continuing to interact and consume with this material, so it kind of emerges later. In the cyber offending pathways, it was present in some it wasn't, but it definitely wasn't central, so potentially there's a lack of a need, and I'll talk for maybe why that is, a need or an existing of a violent propensity. So, ideology might matter sometimes. As I said, it emerged later in sequence, almost layered on top of a pre-existing violent propensity. And, people who work in CT, that won't be anything, novel to them. The sequencing challenges an interpretation of that as ideology as a driver. I don't think anyone would say ideology really, those 100% doctrine-motivated offenders are few and far between these days. But ideology not as a primarily driver of the violence, but layered on top of that violent propensity that already exists as a way of legitimizing violence, of meaning making, and kind of providing, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. So in some research we did many years ago, there was an extreme right-wing offender who went to prison, and then he came out and he wanted to be a jihadi, and before that he'd been a football hooligan. So it's like the t-shirt, the kind of meaning-making framework that you're layering on top of your kind of violent propensity changes. So that's kind of the pattern that we infer seeing going on here. Sextortion primarily operates as a status and kind of belonging economy. The two are really intertwined. Again, these are really simplified pathways, and I'll tell you how you can access the more complicated pathways. But it was one of the clearest pathways in the data set. So social isolation, to seeking belonging, to seeking status, seeking notoriety, and engaging in sextortion. And we see this recursive loop between engaging in the behavior, seeking belonging, seeking status. So it's not so much about the behavior, it's about the function that it's serving. So something else we saw is that the different routes to status. So offline violence, we're kind of getting our status from demonstrative violence. We have that propensity for violence. We've sort of done that before. Demonstrative violence goes hand in hand with those kind of ideological, that sort of ideological framing. Sextortion, we're getting status through the social reward structures, having to engage in sextortion and getting those social rewards from there. Cyber offending, again, Rachel put it beautifully. What I tentatively infer is that the absence of the violent propensity, either they don't need to because they have this technical competence and they can achieve status via that way, or it doesn't need to emerge because they're achieving kind of the status through their technical competence in terms of doing cyber offences. And leadership, they're socially isolated, they don't feel important, they go and start their own group that they're the boss of, right? That's kind of the pattern that we see there. So if we take one thing away, the same vulnerabilities appear, but what differs is how they combine and the functions that they serve. And understanding that kind of functional relevance helps us get at what we do with the people. And also, sometimes we have, I mean, not the people in this room, but sometimes I'm sure you've had conversations with people where we need a comm response. The comm's not one thing that we can respond to. You know, that there's lots of nuance and diversity going on there. One bit of a system might need to take one bit of a system might need to take other. Those are very complicated and difficult decisions that I'm not in charge of, thankfully. So, there is a preprint. In that preprint, there is an interactive dashboard that you can have a look at some of the combinations in far more detail. It's being updated at the minute, so don't at me if there's a discrepancy because we changed it this morning. But yeah, the full paper's up there, it's under review, and the dashboard. The second part of that programme of work is going to be an expert workshop where we get experts in the room and we say, what are the things that you think matter in terms of indicators? What do you think of all that? If anybody in the room is keen on participating, please let us know. We have the date for that. The third part, Sandy's going to take a closer look at can we get AI, LLMs to look at some of this horrible stuff for us and create some sort of tool for some of our end users so that analysts don't have to sit and look at this stuff. So if people are particularly interested in anything else that the project is going to do, then please let me know. Thank you.